Breaking news, the Minnesota Wild have relieved head coach Dean Evason and assistant coach Bob Woods of their duties effective today. We will take a look at what has led to these departures, as well as the reports that former Predators and Devils head coach John Hynes will be named the next Minnesota Wild head coach, all on today's emergency episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
Welcome into a special edition of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we dive into the breaking news that head coach Dean Evason and assistant coach Bob Woods have been relieved of their duties. We'll talk about reports from Michael Russo and Joe Smith that John Hynes will be named the next head coach for the Wild and what he brings to the table and what this means for the rest of the season as well as going forward. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and as you have heard, as has been reported by Michael Russo, Joe Smith, and others, Dean Evason has been relieved of his duties as head coach by the Minnesota Wild. A statement from Bill Guerin after the news: Dean did an excellent job during his tenure with the Minnesota Wild, especially as head coach of our team. I am very thankful for his hard work and dedication to our organization. Guerin also says, I would also like to thank Bob for his hard work during his time as an assistant coach with the Wild. I wish Dean, Bob, and their families all the best in the future. Dean Evason finishes his tenure as Minnesota Wild head coach with a 147, 77, and 27 record through 251 games as head coach, with back-to-back 100-point seasons in 2021, 2022, and 2022-2023. But this season, through 19 games, the Wild sit with a 5-10-4 overall record. Just 14 points. They are currently 30th in the NHL in terms of points. And so the decision made that a new voice is needed to lead the Minnesota Wild and try to get them back on track. Because before we even get into some of the things that led to the firings of Dean Evason and Bob Woods, I think it's important to look at the overall picture as to what is expected of this team the rest of the season. This is a team, this is a franchise that expects that this team is going to be a playoff caliber team at the end of the season. Craig Leopold has told Bill Guerin just as much over the last few years, is that this is a team that needs to compete for a postseason spot, regardless of if there are needs to step back, to reload, retool. This is a team that needs to be in a postseason position year in, year out. That is the floor of expectations for where this team needs to go. And we've seen over the last couple of seasons, this team get to the postseason, but they end up getting beat in similar ways by the opponents, whether it be the St. Louis Blues, whether it be the Dallas Stars, whether it be the Vegas Golden Knights. It seems that the same issues continue to prop up and lead to this team exiting the first round as they have so many times consecutively here over the last few years. And so the move being made, as opposed to being able to change up the lineup, which is really not an option at this point, the change is to try to bring a new voice, a bit of a new system, to try to get the players going and to get different results than have been performing on the ice. And so Dean Evason, as we saw in Edmonton, Dean Evason ends up being the one who pays the price for a large amount of players that are not performing up to the level that they need to in order for this team to achieve their ultimate levels of success. And so you see a team that is struggling with goaltending, with 2 goaltenders in the bottom 6 in the NHL in terms of goals saved above expected. You have a penalty kill that is dead last in the NHL and has been near the bottom for several seasons. And this is a roster that is pretty well set. And so the only thing you can really do is to try to find a new voice to lead the team. Dean Evason leaves the Minnesota Wild with the sixth highest points percentage among active coaches, and his numbers amongst Wild head coaches in previous tenures are amongst the best. So this team obviously achieved a high level of success in the regular season that didn't translate to the postseason, which is why a new voice is being brought in to try to get things back to where they should be for this team as it goes forward. Oftentimes you see this with a roster that underperforms is that a head coach pays the price because it's a lot easier to change the voice in the locker room than it is to make moves and move players with no movement contracts or things along those lines. So Bill Guerin making the decision, and now things are squarely on him. After making this move to bring in, it is reported by Michael Russo and others that John Hynes will be brought in to be the next head coach for the Minnesota Wilds. Now it's on Guerin because this is a roster that he constructed. And if this roster continues to underperform and underachieve while being locked into extensions and no movement clauses, no trade clauses, the only thing that can be done after that to get this team out of what is going on is going to be to have somebody else come in and move pieces around on the board. So this is the last move that Bill Guerin had to play to bring in a new head coach and to see if John Hynes can get more out of this team than Dean Evason was able to do. So we have a lot more to discuss. We'll get into some of the reasons that Dean Evason was ultimately let go by the Minnesota Wild, as well as taking a look at what John Hynes brings to the table. We have a lot more to get to here on today's episode of Locked On Wild, and we will continue after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Collective. If you run a solo small business, you are an army of one, but you still need a CPA, bookkeeper, separate payroll solution, and more. Let Collective take care of the paperwork while you take care of business. Collective is the #1 financial solution for freelancers, contractors, and self-employed entrepreneurs that lets you focus on your passion, not your paperwork. Let Collective handle all of the paperwork you dread, like corporate formation and compliance, taxes, bookkeeping, accounting, and even payroll. The best part? It's at a fraction of the cost of a CPA. Join the thousands of solopreneurs who have saved an average of $10,000 per year on taxes with their structure. Right now, Collective is offering 1 month free and no onboarding fee when you go to collective.com/LockedOnNHL and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That's a $550 value for free when you go to collective.com/LockedOnNHL and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That's collective.com/LockedOnNHL and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. Welcome back to today's emergency episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. And we will have plenty of discussion on the decision to relieve Dean Evason of his duties, as well as what expected head coach John Hynes brings to the team as we move throughout the rest of the week. So make sure to stay with us here as we continue to gather info as to quite a big bombshell from the Minnesota Wild here today. Again, the big story, Dean Evason and Bob Woods relieved of their duties by the Minnesota Wild. Let's start with Bob Woods as to why this happened. And we talked about it a little bit in segment number 1. The Minnesota Wild penalty kill is dead last in the NHL and has given up over 20 goals so far this season alone. And the penalty kill just does not show any signs of getting better. Now, last year, the Wild had Brett McLean, who was in charge of the power play, and they made a change there. They brought in Jason King from the Vancouver organization, and Brett McLean, now the head coach of the Iowa Wild. So they made a change on the power play side of things, and there was talk in the offseason about changing the structure, changing the personnel, and we just have seen similar issues continue to pop up through the first 19 games of the season on the penalty kill. And you can look at the last two postseasons in which, in the St. Louis series 2 years ago and the Dallas series last year, that inability to stop those teams on the power play was a large reason as to why the Wild went home even after a 2-1 lead in both series. The penalty kill fell apart last year, and it just never got going here this season. And even 2 years ago, when the Wild set a franchise record for wins and points, it had its moments of ups and downs. But when you have an offense that was as good as the Wild's was 2 years ago, you can hide a lot of things that are wrong. And so we just have continued to see a decline in that grouping, and there is hardly a team in the NHL that is able to overcome a bad penalty kill. Now, in a bad power play, you can get your way through a season with that. But if you have a bad penalty kill, that is something that you just can't get past if you are a team that's expected to do anything in terms of postseason success or otherwise. So the writing was on the wall for Bob Woods that at some point it was just going to be enough is enough. And it just so happens that with Dean Evason, it came on the same day that Bob Woods was relieved of his duties. On the Dean Evason front, we talk about a lot of the things that have gone wrong with this team over the years. And, you can name off a lengthy list of things that just weren't going right with this team. And we can start with the inability to adjust. In the postseason against St. Louis and in the postseason series last year against Dallas, the Minnesota Wild had 2-1 lead in both series. The teams that they played, the coaches that they played, made adjustments, threw the lines in a blender, did whatever they needed to do in order to win that next game and ultimately win the series. And the Wild held firm to their system and what got them to the postseason and did not adjust in time to be able to stay alive in either series. One of the big constants that has been a problem for the Wild under Dean Evason's tenure is the number of penalties that this team takes and the frequency at which the players and coaches gripe about officiating throughout the course of games. And it reared its ugly head in the game against Detroit, with Ryan Hartman being now suspended officially for 2 games for a slew foot in the game, and Dean Evason criticizing the officiating after the game against the Colorado Avalanche, in which he point blank said that players like Cale Makar were diving. It's a situation where you just have to move past it, and this has been a team that just seems to never be able to move past the officiating. It has been a constant refrain from this group under Dean Evason that the officiating leads to them being put in bad situations, which largely are their doing. So that has been something that has been consistent throughout the Evason tenure. Other things that have gone wrong on Dean Evason's watch, and again, there was a lot of good that Dean did over his tenure as Minnesota Wild head coach, but there have been a lot of other things that we have seen, such as an inability to, for the most part, work with young players. Kalen Addison recently was sent to the San Jose Sharks, never really seemed to get himself in favor with Dean Evason. Kevin Fiala, another example of a player that it just didn't seem like was going to fit with the Dean Evason system. Now, it's not an exclusive problem. We've seen players like Marco Rossi and Brock Faber, who are young, be able to get into the good graces. But Dean Evason, very much a veteran-favored coach, and has been since he started coaching this team. And we've seen that lead to players like Freddie Gaudreau, players like John Merrill, players who should be lower in the lineup getting higher opportunities because they are vets. And that's not an exclusive problem to Dean Evason either. There are a lot of coaches that fit into that type of mold. It's something that has been noted since Dean Evason took over as head coach. So you couple all of that with it seemed like at points throughout this season that there was a lot of throwing whatever could be figured out at the wall to try to see what would work. And there just weren't a lot of consistently good things that went well for the Wild so far this season. And it led to kind of a crescendo over the weekend in which Evason cited the need to focus on more of the positives for this team as opposed to sitting in the negativity. And, that was something that we talked about in today's episode, is that there just haven't been a lot of positives to point out with this team over the course of the season. A team that's won 5 games, they have the second fewest wins in the NHL behind the San Jose Sharks with 4. So there just have not been a ton of positives to be able to point to for this team. And this is just the price of doing business, is a coach that has a good record overall, has been at the helm of 2 100-point seasons. This is a what have you done for me lately league. And over the first 19 games of the season, we've seen 2 closed-door meetings. We've seen Bill Guerin address the team sternly to get back on track. And it has all led to a situation that seems like it's getting worse before it's getting better. So that is why the Wild are looking for a new voice as head coach, because it just seemed like the words in the locker room were falling on deaf ears. And so that means that it is now up to, reportedly, John Hynes to be the one to get it figured out. So we will talk a little bit to finish today's emergency episode of Locked On Wild about what John Hynes brings to the table. We'll talk about his tenures at his previous stops, including a little intel from Locked On Predators. That is all on the way here on Locked On Wild. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. A new NHL season brings all sorts of possibilities, whether it be Marco Rossi scoring a couple of goals or the Vegas Golden Knights inevitably hoisting a second straight Stanley Cup. And you can win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you need to do is pick whether stud players like Nathan McKinnon, Connor McDavid, Alex Ovechkin, or Sidney Crosby will record more or less than their Sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. Entries are so easy, you can do them in under 60 seconds. And you can also play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, and college football on Sleeper too. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. We are your team every day, and we thank you for tuning into this special breaking news edition of Locked On Wild, as Dean Evason and Bob Woods have been relieved of their duties by general manager Bill Guerin. And according to Michael Russo, it sounds as though former Nashville Predators head coach and New Jersey Devils head coach John Hynes will be named the 7th head coach in Minnesota Wild history. Asked Nick Morgan of Locked On Predators for a little intel into John Hynes and why this was the way that the Wild went. And here's what Nick had to say. Players love him. By all accounts, a great guy, extremely system structure-oriented to a fault, questionable track record of managing younger players. That sounds a little familiar. I'm not going to lie. It sounds like the guy that was just shown the door by the Minnesota Wild. And if you want another reason as to why this was the route that the Minnesota Wild went, well, Bill Guerin and John Hynes have history from their time in the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. When Guerin was an executive and was working his way through the minor league system, Hynes was there as well. And it was rumored even that when the Wild were looking for a new assistant coach after Brett McLean took the Iowa Wild job, it was rumored that Hynes was a potential candidate for the assistant coach gig. And so, again, there's another tie between Bill Guerin and John Hynes. If we look at the overall record for Hynes, he has coached a total of seasons, 602 games at the NHL level with the New Jersey Devils and also with the Nashville Predators. 284, 255, and 63 is his career record as a head coach. And that started with 5 years with the Devils, in which he was 150, 159, and 45. His tenure with Nashville, 134, 96, and 18. The big thing to take a look at is that Hynes' career postseason record, 4-15. And John Hynes coached teams have not won a postseason series as of yet. But the things that jump out to me in an initial sweep about what John Hynes brings to the table is, as Nick noted, he is a coach that players respect and that players admire. And he is somebody who sticks to a particular system strictly as head coach. And so this Minnesota Wild team is a team that likes to kind of police themselves when things are going wrong. We've seen that quite a bit. And that was another thing I think that ended up doing Dean Evason in, is that there was far more instances in which the coaching staff let the players try to figure things out. Now, there were more instances this year in which Dean was getting on players for slow starts, poor performances, and trying to, I think, push the notion that the team needed to pick things up in order to get themselves back to where they wanted to be. And so there was more of that this season, but I wonder if we are going to see Hynes take a similar approach, or if he is going to come in and do a little more coaching, seeing what just happened with the Minnesota Wild and with Dean Evason. So that is a big thing that I am curious about as to see how this plays out. The big thing that we are going to have to wait and see is who takes over on the penalty kill and what that looks like, because, again, the penalty kill under Bob Woods has been pretty bad, considering the number of players in which you would consider top-level guys that are playing on that unit, and you're still not able to be successful. So what sorts of changes does John Hynes bring to the table to get that penalty kill back on track? Because what this signifies is that the goal for this team, the goal that Craig Leopold has set as the standard this year, is still a postseason trip. And so this coaching change is done to jolt this team back to where they need to get. Whether or not a postseason berth should be the goal this season, or if this team finally just needs to take a little bit of a look in the mirror and get back to take a step or two back to get some higher draft picks and to just take a look at how this roster is constructed. And if it's done in a manner that is going to allow this team to fully excel, those are things that are just not on the table at this point. And so as long as Craig Leopold is saying that it's postseason or bust, it's full steam ahead for this Minnesota Wild team to try to get back into the postseason picture. And we'll see if John Hynes is able to do so with this same collection of players. One of the biggest things that he's going to need to do is to get some of these players back on track, most notably Matt Boldy, who has been pretty quiet so far this season, but he's not the only one. We've seen Kirill Kaprizov play better over the last few games, but Matt Boldy needs to get going. Marcus Johansson needs to get going. Ryan Hartman needs to get back on track. The names of players that need to get back to performance is a lengthy one, as well as on defense. Hynes is going to need to take a long look at what is going on defensively, because there are a lot of defensive breakdowns that take place with this team that have led to goals and have led to insurmountable deficits for this Minnesota Wild team through these first 19 games. So it is interesting. I think that things seemed to come to a head today after the Sweden series. It seemed like the talk had cooled off, that Dean Evason was safer, not necessarily safe, but safer with the team playing better. It all seemed to change after that game against the Detroit Red Wings on Sunday. And today we get the news that we've got a new head coach that's going to come in and try to get this team back on track. We will, of course, have more on this throughout the week. We'll get some more full intel on John Hynes. We'll take a look at some other things that need to change and what we can expect, who potentially is going to come in to try to get the penalty kill back on track. We have a ton of content at Locked On Wild that we'll be throwing at you here through the rest of this week, including just some more looking at the fallout that led to Dean Evason being relieved of his duties. So we have a lot coming at you. So make sure to stick with Locked On Wild all week long. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already, and make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platforms as well. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.